What if the only reason failure still exists in your life is because you have secretly given it permission to live there? Because somewhere deep in your mind you have accepted the idea that defeat is natural, reasonable, and allowed rather than an illusion born from undisciplined thought? Sit with that question. Because everything you believe about success, effort, struggle, and destiny begins there, in the silent agreement you have made with the concept of failure. Napoleon Hill understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Failure is not an event, it is not a circumstance, it is not a cruel twist of fate. Failure is a mental posture. It is a decision made long before any visible outcome appears. And if you can decide to accept it, you can decide to abolish it. Acting as if failure in 2026 is impossible does not mean pretending that obstacles will disappear. It means refusing to allow obstacles to define the outcome of your life. It means understanding at a psychological level so deep that it reshapes your identity that the mind either commands reality or surrenders to it. There is no middle ground. You have been taught subtly and relentlessly that failure is a teacher, that setbacks are inevitable, that limitation is realistic. These ideas sound mature, even wise, but Hill would tell you they are often nothing more than intellectual disguises for fear. The mind craves safety, and one of its favorite forms of safety is permission to quit without shame. Failure becomes comfortable when it is framed as normal. Yet every enduring achievement in history was born from a mind that rejected this normalization. Hill studied thousands of individuals who bent reality to their will, and he found a single psychological thread running through all of them. They did not negotiate with failure. They did not romanticize it. They did not invite it in as a guest to be learned from later. They treated failure as an enemy to be mastered before it ever materialized. If failure is possible in your mind, it is already in motion. Thought is the beginning of all form. Every condition of your life today was once a quiet assumption. Acting as if failure in 2026 is impossible means you no longer allow your imagination to rehearse defeat. It means you no longer entertain emotional rehearsals of loss, embarrassment, or retreat. Hill called this definiteness of purpose, but it goes deeper than having a goal written on paper. Definiteness of purpose is a mental boundary. It is the line you draw that says this far and no further. Beyond this point, failure does not exist as an option, only as information to refine strategy, strengthen resolve, and deepen discipline. Most people misunderstand desire. They believe wanting something intensely is enough. Hill dismantled that illusion. Burning desire is not emotional excitement. It is a sustained state of internal pressure. It is the refusal to emotionally detach from your aim, even when progress is slow, even when evidence contradicts your expectations. When you act as if failure is impossible, desire stops being a mood and becomes a command. Your mind begins to search obsessively for paths instead of exits. Your imagination stops asking if and starts asking how. This is where the invisible forces Hill spoke of begin to move. The subconscious does not distinguish between what is real and what is vividly, emotionally believed. Feed it the assumption of inevitability, and it will reorganize your perception, your behavior, and eventually your circumstances around that assumption. Faith in Hill's work was never religious sentiment. It was mental alignment. Faith is the ability to hold a thought with such consistency and emotional conviction that it becomes the dominant instruction to the subconscious. Acting as if failure is impossible requires faith not in luck, not in external systems, but in the law that thoughts backed by emotion and persistence crystallize into reality. Doubt is not neutral. Doubt is a counter-command. Every time you indulge doubt, you split your mental energy, weakening the signal you are sending to the deeper layers of your mind. Hill warned that a divided mind cannot create a definite outcome. If 2026 is to be the year where failure has no authority over you, doubt must be treated as a trespasser, not as a reasonable voice. Autosuggestion is the method by which this internal law is enforced. You are already practicing autosuggestion whether you realize it or not. Every inner conversation, every repeated assumption, every emotional reaction is programming you. Most people program themselves unconsciously for limitation, repeating stories of struggle, bad timing, unfair systems. Acting as if failure is impossible means you consciously take control of this process. You speak to yourself as someone who cannot be stopped, not because it feels good, but because repetition shapes belief, and belief shapes behavior. The subconscious accepts repetition as truth. It does not argue. It obeys. When you consistently affirm inevitability, your mind begins to reject opportunities to quit as illogical, even absurd. Persistence is where this philosophy becomes uncomfortable. Persistence is not endurance for its own sake. It is loyalty to a decision. Hill observed that most people fail not because they lack ability, but because they stop one step before the breakthrough. Acting as if failure is impossible means persistence is no longer conditional on results. You persist because stopping is not aligned with your entity. When persistence becomes identity-based, external resistance loses its psychological power. Delays no longer insult you. Resistance no longer humiliates you. They become expected features of a process you have already committed to completing. Self-discipline is the structure that holds all of this together. Without discipline, desire burns out, faith weakens, and autosuggestion becomes inconsistent. Discipline is the daily enforcement of your internal laws. It is choosing long-term command over short-term relief. Hill emphasized that self-discipline is not repression, it is direction. It is the ability to say no to thoughts, habits, and impulses that contradict your purpose. Acting as if failure is impossible requires ruthless honesty about where your energy leaks. Every undisciplined habit is a silent vote for limitation. Every disciplined action, no matter how small, reinforces the identity of someone who does not collapse under pressure. Fear mastery is perhaps the most misunderstood element of Hill's philosophy. Fear is not eliminated by courage. Fear is eliminated by understanding. Fear is the emotional signal of uncertainty. It thrives in vagueness, in undefined outcomes, in half-commitments. When you decide that failure is not an option, fear loses its primary fuel. You may still feel discomfort, but discomfort is not fear. Fear whispers escape. Discomfort demands growth. Hill identified specific fears that sabotage success, but all of them trace back to the same root, the fear of loss. Acting as if failure is impossible reframes loss as temporary misalignment rather than permanent defeat. This psychological shift deprives fear of its authority. Imagination is the workshop of the mind. Hill divided it into synthetic and creative imagination, but both serve the same function, translating thought into form. When you imagine success as inevitable, your mind begins to construct bridges between your current position and your desired outcome. These bridges often appear as ideas, impulses, intuitions. Most people dismiss them because they do not look logical at first glance. Acting as if failure is impossible trains you to respect these inner signals, to act on them before doubt erodes them. This is how invisible forces become visible results. Decision is the pivot point. Hill found that successful people make decisions quickly and change them slowly, if at all. Failure-oriented minds do the opposite. They hesitate, they delay, they wait for reassurance. Acting as if failure is impossible demands decisive commitment. Once a decision is made, it becomes law. Indecision is mental drift. Drift is the absence of purpose. And drift is the natural habitat of failure. When you eliminate indecision, you eliminate the psychological space where failure grows. Understand this clearly. Acting as if failure in 2026 is impossible does not guarantee comfort. It guarantees transformation. It means you will be tested at levels that expose every weakness in your character. But those tests are not punishments, they are confirmations. They exist to strengthen the mental muscles required to hold greater responsibility. Hill believed that success demands equivalent growth in the individual. The greater the aim, the greater the inner restructuring required. You are not battling circumstances. You are battling inherited patterns of thought. You are not fighting the world. You are fighting your own permission to retreat. Every time you choose certainty over excuse, discipline over distraction, decision over delay, you reinforce a psychological reality where failure cannot survive. Not because life is easy, but because your mind is no longer negotiable. This is the beginning of acting as if failure is impossible, not as bravado, not as denial, but as a deliberate, disciplined alignment with the laws that govern achievement. The rest of this journey will demand that you confront the parts of yourself that still cling to safety, to approval, to comfort. But if you are willing to do that work, if you are willing to command your inner world with precision and authority, 2026 will not be another year you endure. It will be the year you prove to yourself above all else that when the mind is mastered, failure has nowhere left to stand. When you decide that failure is impossible, something subtle and unsettling begins to happen inside you. The mind, which for years has been trained to prepare escape routes, suddenly finds itself without permission to retreat. This is where most people unconsciously sabotage themselves. They declare certainty with their words, but their inner world remains negotiated, conditional, filled with quiet clauses that say, unless, except if it gets too hard. Napoleon Hill warned that the subconscious mind does not respond to declarations, it responds to consistency. Acting as if failure is impossible requires the removal of psychological loopholes. It requires that your inner dialogue no longer leaves the door open for collapse. The first battle in this process is definiteness of purpose taken to its extreme conclusion. Most people think they know what they want, but what they really have are preferences, not purposes. A preference bends under pressure. A purpose hardens. Hill observed that the mind cannot organize itself around vagueness. When your aim is unclear, the subconscious remains passive, scattered, obedient to habit rather than vision. Acting as if failure is impossible forces clarity, because ambiguity becomes intolerable. You can no longer afford to say someday, eventually, or I'll see how it goes. Those phrases are psychological anesthetics. They dull the urgency that transformation demands. Definiteness of purpose is not about choosing something that sounds impressive. It is about choosing something that you are willing to suffer for without resentment. The moment discomfort appears, your true level of definiteness is revealed. If your commitment weakens, the purpose was not definite. Hill understood that the universe, whether you interpret that as life, reality, or the deeper intelligence of cause and effect, responds to seriousness, not to wishful thinking, not to excitement. Seriousness is demonstrated through persistence under pressure. Acting as if failure is impossible means your purpose becomes non-negotiable, even to yourself. Burning desire follows naturally, but it must be understood correctly. Desire is often confused with emotional intensity, but emotion without direction is chaos. Burning desire is disciplined obsession. It is the quiet, relentless pull that keeps returning your thoughts to the same aim, regardless of distraction. Hill emphasized that desire must be so strong that it crowds out competing impulses. Acting as if failure is impossible means your desire is no longer diluted by secondary comforts. You stop asking what feels good now and start asking what serves the objective. This is where sacrifice enters the equation, not as punishment, but as alignment. The modern mind resists sacrifice because it has been trained to equate happiness with ease. Hill would argue the opposite. Fulfillment comes from coherence between desire, effort, and identity. When your actions contradict your stated aim, internal friction is created, and that friction manifests as anxiety, procrastination, and self-doubt. Acting as if failure is impossible reduces this friction by forcing congruence. You either act in alignment with your aim or you confront the discomfort of inconsistency. Over time, the mind learns to prefer discipline over inner conflict. Faith at this stage becomes less abstract and more operational. Faith is no longer something you feel, it is something you practice. It is demonstrated by your willingness to act without visible proof. Hill's most controversial insight was that belief precedes evidence, not the other way around. Most people wait for reassurance before committing fully. Acting as if failure is impossible reverses this sequence. You commit first and evidence follows. This is psychologically terrifying for the untrained mind because it removes the illusion of safety. But it is also liberating because it places control back where it belongs within you. The subconscious mind is the great executor of this law. It accepts whatever you impress upon it through repetition, emotion, and action. Autosuggestion is not positive thinking, it is identity engineering. Every repeated statement, every habitual thought, is shaping the mental blueprint from which your behavior emerges. Acting as if failure is impossible means you no longer tolerate internal language that contradicts inevitability. You do not indulge in self-deprecation disguised as humility. You do not rehearse worst-case scenarios as a form of emotional preparation. You understand that what you rehearse, you reinforce. Hill emphasized that autosuggestion works best when combined with emotion. Emotion is the inner why that drives ideas into the subconscious. Fear is one such emotion, which is why negative beliefs embed so deeply. Acting as if failure is impossible requires replacing fear-based emotional energy with controlled intensity. Not manic optimism, but calm certainty. The kind of certainty that does not need validation. Over time, this emotional consistency reconditions the subconscious to expect progress rather than retreat. Persistence then becomes the natural expression of this inner conditioning. Persistence is often portrayed as stubbornness, but Hill described it as intelligent endurance. It is the ability to maintain effort without emotional collapse. Acting as if failure is impossible means you no longer interpret delays as signs of personal inadequacy. You understand that resistance is a function of ambition. The higher the aim, the greater the opposing force. This reframing is critical. Without it, resistance feels personal. With it, resistance becomes expected, even welcomed, as evidence that you are operating beyond your previous limits. Most people abandon their goals not because they are incapable, but because they misinterpret discomfort as a signal to stop. Hill observed that the difference between those who succeed and those who fail is often a single decision made during a moment of fatigue. Acting as if failure is impossible means you anticipate these moments and decide in advance how you will respond. You do not leave critical choices to emotional states. You pre-commit to persistence. This removes the drama from endurance. You persist because that is who you have decided to be. Self-discipline deepens here, moving beyond habit control into emotional governance. It is not enough to manage your schedule. You must manage your reactions. Emotional reactivity is one of the most common forms of self-sabotage. A single moment of anger, discouragement, or self-pity can undo weeks of disciplined effort if it leads to impulsive decisions. Acting as if failure is impossible requires emotional restraint, not suppression, but awareness. You observe your emotions without allowing them to dictate your actions. Hill understood that mastery of self precedes mastery of circumstance. Fear mastery becomes more precise at this stage. Fear is no longer an abstract enemy. It becomes identifiable patterns of thought. Fear of criticism, fear of loss, fear of inadequacy. Hill noted that these fears often operate below conscious awareness, influencing decisions without announcing themselves. Acting as if failure is impossible requires ruthless introspection. You examine not just what you do, but why you hesitate. Every hesitation is a clue. Every avoidance reveals a belief that has not yet been confronted. Imagination, meanwhile, must be trained deliberately. Most people use imagination to worry. They visualize problems in vivid detail, emotionally investing in outcomes they claim they do not want. Hill would argue that this is imagination functioning perfectly, just misdirected. Acting as if failure is impossible means you redirect this faculty toward constructive ends. You repeatedly visualize yourself moving through obstacles, not around them. You imagine resilience, not ease. This conditions the nervous system to remain steady under pressure because the mind has already rehearsed endurance. Decision-making sharpens as a result. Indecision is a symptom of divided desire. When failure remains an option, decisions carry the weight of potential regret. Acting as if failure is impossible removes this weight. You decide based on alignment, not on fear of consequences. This does not mean recklessness. It means clarity. You understand that no decision is risk-free, but indecision carries the greatest risk of all, stagnation. Hill emphasized that successful individuals assume responsibility for their decisions without resentment. They do not blame outcomes, they refine strategy. As this psychological architecture takes shape, something profound begins to happen. Your identity shifts. You no longer see yourself as someone trying to succeed. You see yourself as someone who is executing a process. This distinction is critical. Trying implies uncertainty. Executing implies authority. Acting as if failure is impossible transforms effort into expression. You are no longer chasing an outcome. You are becoming the kind of person for whom that outcome is natural. This shift alters how you experience time. Impatience fades because urgency is internalized. You no longer measure progress solely by external milestones. You measure it by consistency, by discipline maintained, by internal resistance overcome. Hill understood that this internal accounting system is what sustains long-term achievement. External validation is unpredictable. Internal standards are absolute. At this point, the invisible forces Hill spoke of begin to feel less mystical and more mechanical. Cause and effect become visible. Thought influences behavior. Behavior influences results. Results reinforce belief. The loop tightens. Acting as if failure is impossible accelerates this loop because it removes contradictory inputs. You are no longer feeding the system with doubt while expecting confidence as an output. This is where many people become uncomfortable because responsibility becomes total. There is no one left to blame, no circumstance to hide behind. Acting as if failure is impossible means you accept that your inner world is the primary determinant of your outer reality. This is not a comforting idea, but it is a liberating one. It means that change is always possible because it begins within reach. You start to notice that external obstacles lose their emotional charge. Problems become logistical rather than personal. This psychological distance is a sign of maturity. Hill observed that successful individuals rarely dramatize difficulty. They acknowledge it, address it, and move forward. Acting as if failure is impossible cultivates this demeanor. You become calm under pressure, not because you are fearless, but because you are resolved. This resolution is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without it, techniques remain superficial. With it, even imperfect action produces momentum. Acting as if failure in 2026 is impossible is not about arrogance or denial. It is about mental law. It is about understanding that the mind cannot serve two masters. It cannot pursue inevitability while entertaining escape. Once you remove the option of failure internally, every faculty you possess reorganizes itself around forward movement. This is the psychological ground on which the rest of the journey stands. The deeper confrontations are still ahead. The tests will intensify. The demand for discipline will increase. But something irreversible has already occurred. You have stopped negotiating with your own potential, and once that negotiation ends, failure loses its most powerful ally, your consent. The moment you remove consent for failure, life responds by increasing the pressure. This is not punishment. It is calibration. Napoleon Hill understood that the mind only reveals its true level of control when it is challenged beyond comfort. Up to this point, discipline may still feel situational. Commitment may still feel conditional. Chunk 3 is where that illusion is stripped away. Acting as if failure is impossible forces you into direct confrontation with the most dangerous enemy of success, drift. Drift is not laziness. Drift is unconscious living. It is the state in which a person appears active, busy, even ambitious, yet is inwardly ungoverned. Hill warned that drift is the default condition of the human mind unless it is deliberately controlled. Most people do not fail loudly. They fade quietly. They begin with intensity, then slowly dilute their standards. They tolerate small compromises. They delay difficult actions. They rationalize inconsistency. Drift does not announce itself as surrender. It disguises itself as balance, rest, realism. Acting as if failure is impossible requires ruthless awareness of this tendency. You must understand that the mind seeks the path of least resistance, and unless directed with precision, it will always choose comfort over growth. This is why self-discipline in Hill's philosophy is not optional. It is the governing force that prevents drift from reclaiming control. Self-discipline begins with control of thought, but it does not end there. It extends into control of time, energy, emotion, and association. Hill emphasized that the environment you allow around you shapes the thoughts you entertain. Acting as if failure is impossible means you no longer expose yourself casually to influences that weaken resolve. This includes conversations that normalize mediocrity, media that glorifies distraction, and relationships that subtly discourage ambition. This is not arrogance. It is strategic self-respect. You protect you. Our mental space because you understand that thought precedes form. One of the most uncomfortable truths Hill revealed is that many people unconsciously fear success more than failure. Failure is familiar. It carries sympathy. It allows explanation. Success demands responsibility. It demands consistency. It demands that excuses die. Acting as if failure is impossible forces this fear into the open. You begin to notice subtle resistance not when things go wrong, but when they begin to go right. This resistance may appear as procrastination, self-sabotage, or sudden loss of focus. Hill would identify this as the mind testing whether you truly accept the consequences of achievement. Mastery at this stage requires emotional honesty. You must observe your reactions without judgment. When you feel the urge to slow down, to distract yourself, to delay decisive action, you do not immediately obey it. You question it. You ask what belief is driving it. Fear of criticism, fear of expectation, fear of isolation. Hill taught that fear thrives when it remains unnamed. Acting as if failure is impossible means you name fear, examine it, and strip it of its authority. Fear does not disappear through force. It dissolves through understanding. Persistence deepens here into something more demanding than endurance. It becomes persistence of standards. Many people persist in effort while allowing standards to decline. They work longer hours, but with less focus. They remain busy, but less precise. Hill would argue that this is not persistence, it is disguised drift. Acting as if failure is impossible means you persist in quality, not just quantity. You maintain attention to detail even when motivation fades. You execute fundamentals even when novelty is gone. This level of persistence is rare because it requires identity-based discipline rather than emotional drive. Decision-making under pressure reveals the true state of your inner control. When stakes are low, decisions feel easy. When stakes rise, fear seeks to delay commitment. Hill observed that hesitation is often mistaken for careful thought. In reality, prolonged indecision is frequently fear searching for reassurance. Acting as if failure is impossible means you decide even when certainty is unavailable. You accept that clarity often follows action, not precedes it. This is not recklessness, it is trust in your ability to adapt. A decisive mind can correct course. An indecisive mind stagnates. At this stage, imagination must be actively regulated. The same faculty that can propel you forward can also undermine you if left unchecked. Hill warned that imagination fueled by fear becomes destructive. Acting as if failure is impossible requires conscious redirection of mental imagery. When your mind begins to simulate negative outcomes, you interrupt the process, not by suppression, but by replacement. You redirect imagination toward problem-solving, resilience, and controlled execution. Over time, the nervous stem adapts to this pattern. Stress becomes signal rather than threat. The mastery of fear now becomes more refined. Fear of poverty, fear of criticism, fear of ill health, fear of loss of love, fear of old age, fear of death. Hill identified these as the primary fears governing human behavior. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that you confront how these fears influence your decisions. Not abstractly, but practically. Where do you hesitate to invest effort because results are uncertain? Where do you dilute ambition to avoid judgment? Where do you compromise standards to maintain approval? Each answer reveals a fear that still holds power. Faith evolves again at this stage. It becomes quieter, less emotional, more grounded. It is no longer about belief in outcomes, but belief in process. You trust that disciplined action produces alignment, even when results lag behind effort. Hill understood that impatience is one of the greatest enemies of faith. Acting as if failure is impossible requires patience without passivity. You remain active, focused, and disciplined while releasing the need for immediate validation. This emotional maturity is rare, and it is precisely what allows long-term success to compound. Autosuggestion now operates at a deeper level. Your self-talk shifts from encouragement to instruction. You no longer ask yourself if you can handle the pressure. You tell yourself how you will handle it. This distinction is subtle but powerful. Questions invite uncertainty. Instructions reinforce authority. Acting as if failure is impossible means you speak to yourself as a commander speaks to a trusted unit, calmly, clearly, without negotiation. Over time, this internal tone becomes your default state under stress. As discipline stabilizes, you begin to experience a different relationship with effort. Effort no longer feels like resistance. It feels like expression. You are no longer forcing yourself forward. You are executing an internal standard. Hill would describe this as harmony between conscious desire and subconscious acceptance. When this harmony exists, energy is conserved. You waste less effort fighting yourself. This is why highly disciplined individuals often appear calm even under extreme demand. Their energy is not fragmented by inner conflict. Responsibility becomes absolute here. Acting as if failure is impossible eliminates the comfort of external blame. You no longer attribute outcomes to luck, timing, or circumstance. This does not mean you deny reality. It means you accept authorship. You look first at your own decisions, habits, and assumptions. This level of responsibility is heavy, but it is also empowering. It means correction is always possible. Hill emphasized that those who succeed long-term are those who can accept responsibility without self-condemnation. They critique behavior, not identity. At this stage, the invisible forces Hill spoke of become unmistakable. Opportunities begin to appear where none existed before, not because the world has changed, but because perception has sharpened. When your mind is aligned with purpose, it recognizes patterns, connections, and openings that were previously invisible. Acting as if failure is impossible tunes perception toward utility rather than fear. You begin to see obstacles as systems to be navigated, not walls to be feared. This shift also alters how others respond to you. Confidence rooted in discipline is different from bravado. It is quiet, stable, and unmistakable. People sense it. Hill noted that success attracts cooperation when it is backed by certainty and competence. This is not manipulation, it is resonance. When your inner world is coherent, it influences the emotional climate around you. Conversations change, expectations change, standards rise. Yet this is also where isolation may increase. As drift loses its grip on you, you may find fewer people who relate to your intensity. Hill warned that this phase often tempts individuals to soften their edge to regain social comfort. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that you resist this temptation. You understand that not everyone is meant to accompany you through every stage of growth. This is not rejection, it is differentiation. You are not abandoning others, you are honoring your purpose. The internal battle now becomes one of refinement rather than initiation. You are no longer deciding whether to commit. You are deciding how cleanly, how precisely, how relentlessly you will execute. Small lapses matter more now because standards are higher. Acting as if failure is impossible means you address these lapses immediately. You do not allow small breaches to become habits. Discipline is enforced gently but consistently, without drama. This is where many people plateau, not because they lack ability, but because they grow tired of vigilance. Hill understood that sustained success requires sustained awareness. Acting as if failure is impossible means you accept vigilance as a permanent requirement, not a temporary phase. You remain alert to drift. You remain honest about fear. You remain disciplined in thought and action. By the end of this stage, something fundamental has changed. You no longer rely on motivation, you rely on structure, you no longer wait for inspiration, you act from identity. Failure has not merely been rejected, it has been made irrelevant, not because challenges have disappeared, but because your inner architecture no longer collapses under pressure. This is the psychological midpoint of the journey. The foundation has been tested, the mind has been disciplined, the will has been sharpened. What remains ahead will demand even greater clarity, because now the question is no longer whether you will persist, but what you will do with the power you are building. Once the mind has been disciplined and drift has been brought under control, a more subtle and dangerous phase begins. Napoleon Hill understood that the greatest threat to long-term success is not weakness, but misdirection of strength. Power without precision becomes destructive. Confidence without self-awareness becomes arrogance. Acting as if failure is impossible now demands a higher level of internal refinement, because the mind, having tasted control, may attempt to relax its vigilance. This is where many capable individuals sabotage themselves, not through collapse, but through gradual misalignment. At this stage, the inner laws of success become less about effort and more about command. You are no longer struggling to act, you are deciding how to direct force. Hill emphasized that imagination, when combined with definiteness of purpose, becomes the most powerful faculty of the human mind. But imagination is neutral. It amplifies whatever it is attached to. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that imagination be disciplined toward creation rather than indulgence. You must understand the difference between constructive vision and escapist fantasy. One builds reality, the other avoids it. Constructive imagination is grounded in execution. It visualizes not only the outcome, but the process, the resistance, the fatigue, the repetition. It prepares the nervous system for sustained demand. Escapist imagination, by contrast, visualizes rewards without responsibility. It creates emotional highs without corresponding action, draining motivation rather than strengthening it. Hill warned that this misuse of imagination is one of the most common hidden causes of failure. Acting as if failure is impossible means you refuse to indulge in visions that are not matched by discipline. Decision-making now takes on strategic depth. Earlier, decisiveness was about overcoming hesitation. Now it is about choosing direction wisely. Hill observed that successful individuals are not those who act the fastest, but those who act with alignment. Acting as if failure is impossible does not mean pursuing everything aggressively. It means committing selectively and fully. You learn to say no without guilt. You recognize that energy is finite and focus is power. Scattered effort weakens even the strongest will. This is where self-discipline evolves into self-command. Discipline enforces rules. Command sets priorities. You are no longer reacting to demands. You are structuring your life around your purpose. Hill would describe this as living from the inside out. External pressures lose their authority because your internal hierarchy is clear. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that this hierarchy be defended consistently. Every decision is measured against purpose, not convenience. Fear, at this level, becomes quieter but more deceptive. It no longer appears as panic or doubt. It appears as overthinking, perfectionism, excessive caution. Hill understood that fear adapts as the mind evolves. Acting as if failure is impossible requires continuous recalibration of awareness. You must ask not only whether you are afraid, but how fear may be disguising itself as prudence. This requires honesty that is often uncomfortable because it challenges your self-image as rational and careful. Faith now becomes confidence in your ability to recover, not in your ability to avoid mistakes. This distinction is critical. Many people fear decisive action because they equate mistakes with failure. Hill taught that failure is only permanent when it is accepted as identity. Acting as if failure is impossible means you expect missteps, but you do not internalize them. You correct without self-attack. You adapt without retreat. This psychological resilience is what allows sustained momentum over years rather than bursts. Autosuggestion continues to operate, but its tone changes again. It becomes less about reinforcement and more about calibration. You remind yourself not just of inevitability, but of standards. You instruct yourself on how to think under pressure, how to respond to uncertainty, how to maintain composure when outcomes are delayed. This internal dialogue becomes your anchor. Hill emphasized that the quality of your inner conversation determines the quality of your outer results. Acting as if failure is impossible means your inner conversation is disciplined, precise, and unwavering. Persistence now reveals its most advanced form, persistence of identity. You are no longer persisting toward a goal. You are persisting as a person. Your values, standards, and commitments remain stable across changing circumstances. Hill observed that many people succeed temporarily and then regress because their identity was never fully transformed. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that success not be something you achieve, but something you embody. This is where character becomes destiny. At this level, the relationship with time shifts again. You no longer feel rushed, but you also never feel idle. Urgency becomes internal rather than reactive. You are not driven by deadlines alone, but by an internal clock that measures alignment. When you fall short of your own standards, you feel it immediately. This sensitivity is not anxiety, it is precision. Hill believed that this internal feedback system is what separates lasting achievement from fleeting success. The invisible forces Hill described now manifest as patterns of synchronicity, cooperation, and momentum. Not because the universe is rewarding you arbitrarily, but because your behavior has become consistent enough to create predictable outcomes. When your actions align daily with your purpose, cause and effect become reliable. Acting as if failure is impossible removes randomness from your life. You begin to see that what once felt like luck was often simply alignment misunderstood. However, this is also where ego can emerge as a threat. Confidence rooted in results rather than discipline becomes fragile. Hill warned that pride precedes collapse because it dulls awareness. Acting as if fail. Your is impossible requires humility, but not in the sense of self-diminishment. It requires humility before the process. You respect the laws that govern success. You do not assume exemption from discipline. You understand that the moment you relax vigilance, drift waits patiently to return. Relationships are further refined at this stage. You become more selective, not out of superiority, but out of necessity. Hill emphasized the power of the mastermind principle, the alignment of minds toward a common aim. Acting as if failure is impossible means you seek association that reinforces growth, not comfort. Conversations become purposeful. Energy exchange becomes intentional. You withdraw from environments that drain focus, even if they are familiar. This is one of the most emotionally challenging aspects of growth, because it often requires quiet separation rather than dramatic change. Emotionally, you experience fewer extremes. The highs are calmer, the lows are shorter. This emotional stability is a sign of maturity. Hill understood that emotional volatility is exhausting and unsustainable. Acting as if failure is impossible stabilizes the inner climate. You no longer ride motivation, you operate from commitment. This steadiness allows you to endure periods of monotony, which is where most ambitions quietly die. Monotony is the unspoken test of greatness. It is easy to feel driven when progress is visible. It is harder when effort feels repetitive and unacknowledged. Hill observed that those who endure monotony without resentment eventually separate themselves from the masses. Acting as if failure is impossible means you accept monotony as the price of mastery. You do not require constant novelty to remain engaged. You find meaning in execution itself. At this point, success begins to feel less dramatic and more inevitable. This is dangerous if misunderstood. Inevitability does not mean ease. It means reliability. You trust yourself to show up, to execute, to correct, to persist. Hill believed that self-trust is the highest form of confidence. Acting as if failure is impossible is ultimately about building this trust through repeated proof. Every time you keep a commitment to yourself, you strengthen it. Every time you break one, you weaken it. The internal battle now becomes quieter, but no less demanding. You are no longer fighting chaos, you are maintaining order. Order requires constant attention. Hill understood that discipline, once established, must be maintained deliberately. Acting as if failure is impossible means you do not romanticize rest as escape. Rest becomes strategic, not avoidant. You recover to execute better, not to withdraw. As this phase matures, you begin to recognize that success is not something that happens to you. It is something that flows through you. You become a conduit for disciplined thought, purposeful action, and sustained effort. Hill would describe this as alignment with the invisible laws of achievement. You are no longer resisting reality, you are cooperating with it consciously. This cooperation brings a sense of quiet authority. You no longer need to announce ambition. You demonstrate it through consistency. You no longer need to defend your choices. You live them. Acting as if failure is impossible has reshaped your internal world so thoroughly that external validation becomes secondary. You know what you are building, and you know why. This stage prepares you for the final and most demanding confrontation, total responsibility for the influence you now wield over your own life and the lives you affect. Power amplifies impact. The next phase will demand that you decide not only how far you will go, but who you will become as you go there. There comes a point in this journey where the question is no longer whether you will succeed, but whether you are prepared to live with the weight of that success. Napoleon Hill understood something that is rarely spoken aloud. Success intensifies life. It sharpens consequences. It removes hiding places. Acting as if failure is impossible eventually places you face to face with a deeper responsibility, not just to achieve, but to govern yourself at a higher standard than before.
This is the phase where inner mastery is tested not by adversity, but by capability.
Up to now, pressure has been your teacher. Resistance has shaped your discipline. But now strength itself becomes the test. When you are capable, when momentum is real, your decisions carry impact. The margin for self-deception narrows. Hill observed that many people collapse at this stage, not because they cannot endure hardship, but because they have not learned to endure power. Power magnifies whatever is within. If discipline is incomplete, power exposes it. If purpose is vague, power distorts it. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that you refine not just your habits, but your character. Character, in Hill's philosophy, is not moral decoration, it is structural integrity. It is what determines whether success compounds or corrodes. Acting as if failure is impossible means you cannot allow private lapses to coexist with public ambition. Inconsistency at this level becomes expensive. Small compromises no longer remain small, they propagate. You begin to see that every decision, no matter how trivial it seems, reinforces or weakens the person you are becoming. This awareness is sobering. It demands vigilance without paranoia. Responsibility now expands beyond self-control into self-leadership. You are not merely managing impulses, you are setting direction. Hill emphasized that leadership begins internally. If you cannot lead your own thoughts, emotions, and standards, you cannot be trusted with larger outcomes. Acting as if failure is impossible means you hold yourself accountable without cruelty and without excuse. You evaluate behavior honestly. You correct swiftly. You do not dramatize mistakes, but you do not ignore them. At this stage, fear returns in its most sophisticated form, fear of influence. Influence changes how others perceive you. Expectations rise. Projection intensifies. Hill noted that many individuals unconsciously sabotage progress to avoid standing out. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that you accept visibility without shrinking. You do not seek attention, but you do not hide competence either. You understand that influence is a byproduct of alignment, not ego. Faith becomes deeply internal now. It is no longer faith in outcomes or even in process. It is faith in your capacity to remain disciplined under expansion. You trust yourself not to abandon standards when conditions improve. This is rare. Many people are disciplined only when survival demands it. Acting as if failure is impossible means discipline is maintained even when comfort is available. Especially then. Comfort is the greatest test of commitment because it tempts you to relax vigilance. Autosuggestion at this stage focuses on identity preservation. You remind yourself not of what you want, but of who you are committed to being. You reinforce standards, not dreams. Hill understood that dreams evolve, but standards must remain firm. Acting as if failure is impossible means your internal language protects you from entitlement. You do not tell yourself you deserve ease because you have worked hard. You tell yourself you must remain sharp because you have built momentum. Persistence now becomes invisible. To others, but absolute within. You no longer need external struggle to prove resolve. You persist through subtle erosion, complacency, distraction, overconfidence. Hill warned that success often carries the seeds of its own undoing. Acting as if failure is impossible requires that you identify these seeds early. You remain alert to the softening of effort, the loosening of routines, the rationalization of delay. You treat these signs seriously, not emotionally. Imagination, once again, must be disciplined. At this level, imagination can inflate identity if unchecked. You may begin to imagine yourself as an exception to rules, as someone who has outgrown fundamentals. Hill would caution that no one outgrows fundamentals. Acting as if failure is impossible means you return to basics repeatedly, not because you are regressing, but because mastery lives there. You refine what you already know. You deepen execution rather than seeking novelty for stimulation. Decision-making now carries ethical weight, not in a moralistic sense, but in a structural one. Your decisions shape not just outcomes, but trajectories. Hill believed that integrity is alignment between thought, word, and action. Acting as if failure is impossible requires integrity because misalignment creates internal conflict, and internal conflict weakens clarity. You choose consistency over convenience. You accept short-term discomfort to preserve long-term coherence. This phase often feels quieter, heavier, more solitary. External applause fades. Internal standards rise. Hill observed that this solitude is not loneliness but concentration. Acting as if failure is impossible means you do not seek distraction from this intensity. You accept it as the price of operating at a higher level of responsibility. You understand that not everyone will relate to this phase, and you stop needing them to. Emotionally, you experience a deeper calm, but also deeper seriousness. You are less reactive, but more intentional. You no longer chase motivation, you manage energy. Hill understood that energy management is critical at advanced stages of success. Burnout is not caused by effort alone, but by misaligned effort. Acting as if failure is impossible means you align effort with purpose, reducing waste. You rest strategically. You work deliberately. You do not oscillate between extremes. The invisible forces Hill described now feel less mysterious and more exacting. Cause and effect become unforgiving. When standards slip, results reflect it quickly. When alignment is maintained, momentum builds almost quietly. Acting as if failure is impossible teaches you to read these signals without emotion. You adjust behavior, not identity. You respond, not react. This is also where service enters the equation, not as charity, but as contribution. Hill believed that lasting success is connected to value creation beyond the self. Acting as if failure is impossible eventually forces you to ask what your disciple line is in service of, not in grand terms, but in practical impact. How does your work improve systems, solve problems, create order? This question grounds ambition. It prevents narcissism. It stabilizes purpose. You begin to see that success pursued solely for personal validation is fragile. It depends on recognition. It collapses under criticism. Acting as if failure is impossible requires a purpose that extends beyond ego. This does not mean self-erasure. It means integration. You align personal fulfillment with contribution. This alignment generates resilience because meaning is no longer dependent on applause. As this realization settles, pressure changes quality. It becomes chosen rather than imposed. You carry responsibility willingly because you understand its role in growth. Hill emphasized that responsibility is not a burden when it aligns with purpose. It is a privilege. Acting as if failure is impossible reframes responsibility as evidence of trust, both from yourself and from life. By now, failure is not merely rejected. It is incompatible with your internal structure, not because you are perfect, but because you are governed. Your standards correct deviation quickly. Your discipline absorbs shocks. Your purpose filters decisions. This is not invincibility, it is stability. And stability is what allows long-term creation. Yet one final confrontation remains, the most difficult one. The confrontation with total ownership. Ownership of outcomes, ownership of direction, ownership of the fact that your life as it unfolds now is no longer accidental. The next phase demands that you stand fully inside that truth, without retreat, without deflection, without excuse. This is where commitment becomes irreversible, and where the final decision about who you will be is no longer theoretical but lived. There is a moment, quiet and unmistakable, when you realize there is no longer anything left to negotiate, no excuse that still sounds convincing, no delay that feels justified, no external force left to blame. Napoleon Hill understood that this moment is the true dividing line between those who flirt with greatness and those who embody it. Acting as if failure is impossible ultimately brings you here, to the edge of absolute responsibility, where the final illusion dissolves, the illusion that someone else will decide the weight of your life. At this stage, success is no longer an ambition, it is a standard, and standards are merciless. They do not care how you feel. They do not bend to fatigue. They do not lower themselves to accommodate comfort. They simply exist, demanding alignment or exposing deviation. Hill taught that the mind becomes powerful only when it accepts this kind of authority over itself. Not external authority, internal law, the law that says you will do what you decided to do, regardless of mood, circumstance, or resistance. This is where many people quietly step back, not because they cannot continue, but because continuing requires the death of the old identity, the identity that needed sympathy, the identity that needed permission, the identity that survived by explaining rather than executing. Acting as if failure is impossible means you allow that identity to dissolve completely. You do not drag it with you into the future as a backup plan, you let it end. Hill warned that the subconscious mind clings to familiar patterns, even painful ones, because familiarity feels safe. Total commitment feels dangerous because it removes psychological escape routes. But it is only when escape routes disappear that the full force of the mind becomes available. When failure is no longer an option internally, energy that was once divided becomes unified. Thought, emotion, and action align into a single direction. This alignment is power. You now understand that success was never something outside you waiting to be claimed. It was something inside you waiting to be commanded. Every principle Hill taught was pointing toward this realization. Definiteness of purpose was training you to choose one direction and close all others. Burning desire was teaching you to sustain pressure without collapse. Faith was conditioning you to move without reassurance. Autosuggestion was rewiring your identity. Persistence was hardening your resolve. Self-discipline was structuring your behavior. Fear mastery was stripping fear of its authority. Imagination was building pathways where none existed. Decision was teaching you to act without apology. All of it was preparation for this moment. Now the question is no longer philosophical. It is practical. Will you live as someone who knows these laws or as someone who obeys them? Knowledge without obedience is self-deception. Hill was clear about this. The world is full of people who understand success intellectually and remain defeated emotionally. Acting as if failure is impossible demands obedience to what you now know. Not tomorrow, not when conditions improve. Now. From this point forward, your life will respond to the standards you enforce, not the dreams you describe. Every morning you wake up, you will either reinforce inevitability or reintroduce doubt. Every decision you make will either confirm authority or invite drift. Every excuse you tolerate will either weaken your structure or expose where it still needs reinforcement. There is no neutral ground left. You will feel resistance again, not the crude resistance of fear and confusion, but the refined resistance of comfort, distraction, and self-importance. It will whisper that you have done enough, that you deserve to slow down, that intensity is no longer necessary. Understand this clearly. That voice is the final strategy of failure, not dramatic collapse, but quiet erosion. Acting as if failure is impossible means you recognize this voice instantly and deny it power. This does not mean living in tension or misery. It means living in command. It means you choose your pressure rather than letting life choose it for you. Hill believed that disciplined individuals experience less suffering, not more, because they are not constantly repairing the damage of avoidance. They face difficulty once directly instead of endlessly through regret. You are no longer preparing. Preparation is over. You are no longer becoming ready. Readiness is a decision, not a feeling. From this moment on, you execute as someone for whom quitting is not part of the mental vocabulary. You do not threaten yourself with consequences. You do not bargain with your future. You simply act consistently, relentlessly, according to the standard you have chosen. Understand the gravity of this. No one is coming to rescue you from your own potential. No one will force you to live at the level you are capable of. That responsibility is entirely yours, and that is not a burden. It is the ultimate privilege. Hill taught that freedom is not the absence of discipline, but the ability to direct it toward a purpose of your own choosing. So now decide, not emotionally, decisively. Decide that in 2026, failure does not exist as an outcome, only as feedback. Decide that retreat is no longer a strategy available to you. Decide that your inner world will no longer tolerate contradiction between what you say you want and how you live. Decide that discipline, It's not something you practice when it is convenient, but something you embody because it defines who you are. Commit to the standard that your thoughts will be controlled, your emotions governed, your actions deliberate. Commit to the reality that no excuse, no delay, no fear will be allowed to override your purpose. Commit to acting every day as someone who has already removed failure from their mental architecture. Do not wait for confidence. Act and confidence will follow. Do not wait for clarity. Move and clarity will emerge. Do not wait for motivation. Discipline yourself and motivation will become irrelevant. This is the law Hill revealed, and it does not bend for anyone. Stand now, fully inside your responsibility. Accept the cost. Accept the pressure. Accept the solitude if it comes, and then move forward without hesitation, without apology, without retreat. Act as if failure in 2026 is impossible, because the moment you decide that it is, your mind will begin constructing the only reality left available to you, the one where you win by refusal to quit, by mastery of self, and by total uncompromising commitment to the life you have chosen to live.